Joining us in studio is Madeleine Kearns. Maddy is an associate editor at the Free Press and the author of a recently reported article, The Young Catholic Women Bringing Back Veils. Welcome to Jesuitical, Maddy.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And thank you for recommending this prebiotic soda.
The prebiotic soda, yeah, the delightful strawberry and lemon flavor.
Yes,
yeah, really
healthier than our normal fare on the show.
Allegedly. I'm not sure. It tastes too good to be really healthy, I think.
Yeah.
But really excited to talk to you today, especially about your piece on veiling. But before we get started, if you could just maybe define what veiling is, because I think that will make sense in certain Catholic circles, but not to everybody.
Yeah, so it's the normally made of lace or silk. It's a head covering that women wear at Mass. They don't wear it outside of that context typically. Well, they might wear it in church. And this is something that's been part of the church's history and tradition for a long time, but it really fell out of practice after Vatican II. And then in recent years, we've seen a resurgence in some parishes. And it's not just traditional Latin Mass parishes, which I think you'd expect to see veiling. It's also Novus Ordo parishes. And so that's led a lot of people to wonder what's going on, including me.
Well, I'm curious. I was surprised when I saw this story in the Free Press. I've been following this. This is a kind of a startup. It started as a newsletter. Now I don't know if you'd call it a website or a web publication, but it was started by these two exiles from the New York Times looking for more ideological diversity, hard-hitting investigative reporting. So when I saw a story about veils, which feels like a very niche Catholic issue, I was like, wonder why they're interested in it over there. So how does it fit into the Free Press's mission?
Yeah, so I think we are just curious journalists and we want to bring stories that maybe don't get coverage from other places or maybe don't get the kind of fair and honest coverage that they deserve. And I think religion generally is a topic that typically a lot of outlets don't necessarily understand or they tend to kind of box things into black and white and there's maybe a lack of nuance. And so I think with a topic like this, especially where you're talking about traditionalism in religion and what does that mean? And, nowadays everything can very quickly become politically divisive. I wanted to kind of actually figure out, okay, beyond just the superficial reasons why somebody might wear a veil, what are some of the deeper theological reasons? What do the women who wear the veil really feel about it and think about it? And as you would expect, nobody really said the exact same thing. I was really amazed with the response to that piece. There was a lot of people, and it wasn't just Catholics. I received a nice email from some Jewish readers saying, this is so interesting. Here's how it reminds me of an aspect of my faith. People who had very strong opinions about it one way or another, certainly more feminist people maybe do think it's regressive, and then more traditionally minded people have their view. So it's funny how something seemingly niche to do with Catholic culture that's not even that common in Catholic practice can really just spark off these big conversations.
Well, I guess maybe that's a good place to start. How when we say bringing it back, it's you said yourself, it's not widespread, so to speak, right? Where do you see this pop up? How often? Sure.
So I would probably say it's a growing and significant minority of women who wear the veil. And I have noticed it over the past 10, 15 years maybe. I've just noticed there's a young, and it's more if you see an older Hispanic lady, it's less, again, you're okay, that makes sense with her culture and probably her upbringing. But it's when you see these young women and you think, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what's going on there. And I definitely have noticed it in my own parish. I've noticed it when traveling and going to other parishes. I mean, that's just obviously anecdotal. There are some, I go into it in my piece, there are some figures, no grand survey or anything, but just the women who make the veils have noticed a big boon in their business compared with 10, 15 years ago. I think one was saying she used to make about 30 or 60 a month and now she makes 900 a month and is selling them. So there is an increase. Exactly how large it is hard to say.
Now, before we do deeper questions, I have a few more superficial ones.
Sure.
How does it stay on?
How does it stay on? That's such a great question.
Bobby pins.
Are there bobby pins involved?
I am going to assume there's bobby pins. I'm outing myself here as a not not thorough enough journalist that I did not ask this critical question.
Well, you're also outing yourself as someone who does not veil.
I do not wear the veil myself. Yes, but I'm gonna assume it's bobby pins.
That's my assumption as well.
I think there's also like somebody I was speaking to who does know a lot about veiling was telling me like, sometimes I see young women wearing it. She herself was like early 40s. She was like, I see young women wearing it and they're wearing it like upside down, and I want to go over and tell them like that's not how you wear it.
Well, I imagine like lace, you could probably get some traction. There's enough of a texture different, but silk, I feel like
silk is and these are like the high. I say lace and silk, like ideally lace and silk. I mean, some people are also getting them off Amazon, and it's maybe like polyester, so
kind of like those shawls you put on at the Vatican if you have a strapless shirt on.
Exactly, like the tourist ones. It's like here, take this
I have a nickname for that I won't say on this podcast, which is a family podcast, but maybe if you come up to me at a live event, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Can you put veiling in the context of the Catholic Church over the last, 60-something years? What was it like before Vatican II? What changed at Vatican II that made it kind of go out of mainstream use? And when did it start coming back as a trend among younger Catholics?
Yeah, so I think in the Church's history, certainly if you want to go really far back, St. Paul, it was expected that women would cover their heads. Now, that's not necessarily veils in the sense we were talking about, but that's an ancient practice. That's a practice that really has to be understood in its historical context. So he was speaking to an ancient audience in terms of like contemporary standards of modesty or proprieties, maybe a better word. He's also talking about like the distinction between men and women. These are things that were just sort of part of the Church's tradition for a very long time. I think what happened with Vatican II is there was a general relaxing of...
But like before Vatican II, was it mandatory? Everyone was doing it,
well,
and they'd been doing it for centuries? Or do you know if
it's been practiced inconsistently throughout the Church's history. So it was never like an official rule. I think in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, it was strongly recommended. But again, that's, if you think of the sweep of the Church's history, like 1917 is like still fairly modern. Mm-hmm. So I don't get the impression it was like ever required by the Church officially, but it was certainly like part of the Church's culture. And I know this is the case in traditional Latin Masses still. There are some where if you go in without one, somebody will come up to you and offer you one. So I certainly think there was a strong urging for women to do it. And they probably, a lot of them did it unthinkingly, right? It was just like what you did. You went into Mass, you wore your veil or your
This is
hat.
how like culture manifests itself often. It's in this gray space between like what is, prescribed by law and what is just practiced by people, I feel like.
Exactly. And then in the 60s as well, like hats were the thing, right? Everyone loved wearing hats. You had like Jackie Kennedy with her pillar box hat and, so there's a strange kind of overlapping between Church tradition, what was the expected standards, what was, kind of like you were urged to do. Then there's like fashion. Then there's just like, as you're saying, what everybody else is doing because it's the culture. So I wouldn't say that necessarily everybody pre-Vatican II who was wearing a veil was like doing so out of a sense of like piety. I think they were doing so out of a sense of norm. It was the norm.
And then when the new liturgy arises after Vatican II, was there a dramatic fall off? It was just like, okay, we don't do this anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think you didn't have to cover your head anymore. There's a relaxation. In fact, there's an interesting kind of parallel with what happened in religious life, because I think in some ways that's a more obvious example where there was a move away from strictly religious dress, religious garb, and you had secular clothing.
Like nuns losing the habit.
Exactly. Yeah. Nuns losing the habit.
Jesuits gaining J. Crew.
Jesuits. Sharply dressed Jesuits. Like, yes, absolutely. So there's this interesting thing that's happening. And I think part of the reasoning behind that was like, okay, we're going to be more like the world, not in a religion or a religious or interior sense, but we're going to be more like the world in terms of our reach and our ability to reach people and make people feel comfortable. And I certainly think there was elements of that in the Catholic Church. And it wasn't just veiling and stop and cover your head. It was also the direction, the priest face. I can't remember the Latin term for it, but you may know. Whether
ad orientem.
That's it. There we go. There you go. Gold star for you. So yeah, there's all these different things. It was a change if I may use the non-technical term, it was a major vibe shift. That
Major vibe shift.
Yes.
Now, one of the things I find interesting about this is you mentioned you heard from people from other faith traditions and how it applies. And it's something you see, at least in all of the Abrahamic faiths, like some element of covering. But I'm curious if you learned anything about how this applies in other faith traditions.
Yeah, so I didn't really focus a lot on other faith traditions. I think the biggest point of difference is that we're talking about what you do when you're in a sacred space specifically. So my understanding, and I'm not the right person to speak authoritatively on this, but my understanding with Islam, for instance, is that you're covering your head like all the time, and that's a modesty thing. Whereas this is the women I were speaking to, the Catholic women I were speaking to, it was really, this is something we want to do to alter our disposition and as a mark of reverence for the space that we're in when we're at Mass or in a church, in a Catholic church. So I do think there's a difference there. The similarity is probably just this sense of, first, a difference between the sexes. I think that's common in the three Abrahamic religions. And then also a sense of reverence and a sense of ordering yourself toward God. And so I think that connection that women feel when it is a theological thing that they've thought out, I think that probably is similar in the other religions.
I want to get to the people you talked to for your article, because one thing I appreciated about it is it didn't start with this like ideological lens, because so quickly these liturgical issues turn into wars when Catholics are talking about them. And a lot of the young women you were talking to, you know, they started veiling because they thought it was pretty or they saw their friends doing it. And then maybe it evolved into something more meaningful. But it didn't start from an ideological space.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, hey, like, I'm going to make a political statement. Like, it's not like wearing, like, I don't know, a Trump T-shirt or something. Like, that's clearly you're making a political statement. The one thing they all had in common was that they were all really, really into their faith. And they wanted to express that in an outward sense. And, you know, Catholicism is very rich in its symbols, in its outward expressions of the faith. And so I think this was an expression of that. And yeah, it was, I think they were very aware, sometimes hyper aware of some of the possible interpretations of the veil and how it plays into the politics of it, if you will. But that wasn't, as they were expressing it, that was not their primary or even secondary motivation. That was kind of like this thing happening in the side that they were trying hard not to get too bogged down in.
What are some of the ideological political implications that often are either felt or projected onto or real in some cases?
Yeah, so I think one of the obvious ones is just the division in the church recently over the traditional Latin Mass. And, you know, people obviously have very strong feelings about that, and obviously Pope Francis has made certain decisions that have been controversial within the church. And I think the more traditionally minded Catholics some of them are aggrieved by that. So they may well be wearing a veil for religious reasons, but other people might perceive that and say, oh, wait, I'm associating that with traditionalism. These are those annoying people that Pope Francis is trying to get in line. And so there's that dynamic. There's also the kind of, and to be honest, I don't think this is as much of a thing for within the church. I think this is possibly like a secular lens looking at this issue, but there is also an element of like gender politics. You know, certainly I think that the veil is very feminine and it's meant to emphasize femininity, and typically the women who are wearing the veil, not always, you might get one wearing a veil who's wearing jeans, but like typically they dress a certain way, and that can also rub people up the wrong way if they're more progressively minded or don't like the idea of women in more traditional gender roles. I think that's another area where people feel sort of suspicious
I was going to ask if, in terms of why this is happening now, if it is, in some respects, a reaction to a culture that is tending to flatten difference between genders, or, you know, just between everything.
Yeah.
Like, everything's commercialized, everything just seems the same, and you can pick and choose what you want and all of that.
So it's so interesting because my first guess when I looked into it was precisely that. It was a kind of a reaction to the culture, and especially the secular culture, and maybe, you know, within the church, elements of the church that have gone in that direction. And when I put this to the women I were interviewing, quite a few of them would say things like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good point, and I am against those things, that I do like that this, you know, this cuts against that. But it wasn't really their motivation, at least not consciously.
Well, it's like most people don't actually think about, like, when you're just living your normal life, hanging out with your friends, going to church with your friends, you're not necessarily thinking about fighting against the culture. You're just kind of existing.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you're in church. Like, you might be fighting against the culture, you know, out on the street. Like, if you're wearing a T-shirt that says something like pro-life and proud, like, that's maybe like, I'm engaging with the culture. Like, I'm unafraid to wear this at the gym, like, whatever. But if you're going to church, like, you're already in church. So unless you're fighting against what you perceive as like a subculture within the church, then that would be an odd thing to do. But like I say, it really wasn't the primary motivation. And I think if these women had thought about it at all, it was very much like an afterthought.
I want to get into sort of the elephant in the room, which is just like this conversation just like brings up a sense of judginess.
Yeah.
Everyone is thinking everyone is judgy when we talk about stuff like this. And I'm certainly guilty of it. And part of this is because I had an experience of traditional Catholicism, particularly when I was in college. I attended the traditional Latin Mass, and I totally thought I was better than other people because of it. I kind of had the sense of Catholicism is ancient. This is a more ancient liturgy, therefore a better liturgy. And if I attend this, that makes me a better Catholic. Now, I know there are lots of people that attend the Latin Mass that are not as prideful as I am. But so when I see someone like sort of like doing a thing that's different or extra than what the community is doing, I'm inclined to be like, okay, we get it. You are holier than we are.
Yeah.
Good for you. Which is, I think, a lot of people's reaction when they see women veiling. Were the women you talk to aware of this dynamic?
Oh, yeah. And actually, a lot of them were hyper aware of the dynamic. And I think actually, interestingly, the ones who are most self-conscious about it are the ones who are veiling at a Novus Ordo parish. Because as you say, there it's not really the norm. If you're doing it at TLM Mass, okay, like so is most people.
Yeah.
But I think it already tells you something. The fact that they're attending a Novus Ordo parish, the fact that they accept that the post-Vatican II Mass is legitimate and they're going there, like it already kind of tells you like they're clearly not the caricature, the traditionalist caricature that you would expect. I think they're very worried about the judgment thing. In fact, one of the women I spoke to said that she does campus ministry and she stopped wearing her veil because even though she loves it and thinks it's a beautiful practice and she got a lot from it, she stopped wearing her veil because she didn't want maybe Catholics who maybe aren't going to Mass every week or maybe Catholics or maybe even just Christians who are interested in going to Mass on campus from seeing her in the veil and thinking she's not approachable.
I think it's a really mature attitude in some ways, especially if you are in a position of like ministry, right, where you're trying to bring people in and you know that would be like a sensitive thing that might set some people off. Like, I think that's...
And it makes me think that so much of the like judginess is just based on like projection and like attributing motives that aren't there to people, because if that's the type of person that's veiling at the Novo Ordo Mass, like I don't know, they don't think they're holier than thou, and the only person who's projecting on that is the person who feels judged by this person.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think it's an interesting thing that, I mean, as human beings, we're all pretty judgmental. Let's be honest. Like,
I'm just the only one that's honest about it.
No, it's
I judge you for being so judgmental.
It's really hard not to be judgmental. It's kind of the way we're wired, and obviously we try and fight against it. But with something like this, it just reminds you that, like, look, it's really possible to be judgmental, like whatever your views are, whichever side, whether you lean more liberal, whether you lean more conservative, like it's perfectly possible that you could be like judging someone as judgmental, for instance. Like,
right.
That is like a thing that happens a lot. And people just don't think of it because they're like, no, but I'm so inclusive and nice. Whereas that person's so judgmental, but you don't know anything about that person. And I think that the thing that the women who were the veils were telling me was they had to really get to a place for it to be worth doing for them and it not to be just a total distraction. They really had to get to a place where they're like, okay, I'm just going to be detached from what other people are thinking, and I'm just going to focus on the Mass and why I'm here, and I'm just going to like hope and pray that that's what other people are doing, because otherwise it does just become this, oh, what am I, if you're spending the whole of Mass worrying about what you're wearing, then like, why are you wearing it?
Yeah, I think that's a problem. But I do think this like idea of I'm just going to focus on me in the Mass is actually like kind of gets to the root of this issue, because is liturgy an individual experience or is it a communal one, right?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is, of course, it's both, right? But for example, like if I go to a parish and people are holding hands during the Our Father, I'm not going to like slap someone's hand away, right? I'm going to go with it. If I go to one where they're not and people kind of only put their hands up halfway, that's my preferred method, I think, is sort of like the, are we doing this, are we not thing. That's my preferred way. I'll do that. Or if people just sit there with their hands crossed, I'll do that. Because in general, I'm trying not to stick out.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to draw attention to myself, which is not totally true. When I'm singing, I'm trying to draw attention to myself. But I think that's bad.
Yeah.
So like this idea of like, if you know you're drawing attention to yourself, in the response is, well, I'm just not going to worry about that. The thing I would gently challenge people into is, well, maybe you should a little.
Well, why is something as simple as a veil like distracting, or like, I don't know. People wear lots of different outfits to Mass, and we don't be like, we all need to wear the same colors so that you don't stick out. Like,
well, I think it's because of all of the like
again, it's
associations with
what you think they're
like
doing.
yeah, but like it's not. If a lot of people think this thing means that I want to go back to how it was in the 1950s, then you can't just be like, well, all those people are wrong, because that's not what I think. Like there is a communal aspect to meaning.
I get what you mean, but I probably agree more with you, Ashley, in the sense that if we take that rule, and like I think as Catholics we are quite conformist, and we want to just blend in, and that's part of the everybody stands up at the same time, everybody sits down at the same time. There's this uniformity to it. But I think if you go too far down that road, you start doing things that, like, let's say you have bright blue hair and you're in a more traditional parish. Should you feel uncomfortable going into that church because you have bright blue hair? And to some people, having bright blue hair means you're whatever.
Are you talking about the Vatican's pilgrimage mascot, Luce?
I'm not actually, but yeah. Or take another example. Take like the homeless person who is in complete tattered rags, and they go into church. Nobody else is in complete tattered rags. Should they feel uncomfortable? Should they feel not welcome because they're dressed differently than other people, even though that signifies a certain thing to do with class and social status? Like, absolutely not. So I take the point that, like, you know, some things are appropriate in a church context and some aren't. And obviously, like, if you don't have any money, that's not your fault. But like, you aspire to just, you know, dress in a way that's not going to be offensive to other people. But I also think that if you've thought about it and you've kind of discerned in yourself, like, I'm doing this for the right reasons, you should not be deterred because other people might judge you. And that's kind of a principle we should have in both inside the church and outside the church. If the behavior itself is good or neutral, we shouldn't change it just because we're worried about how other people are going to perceive it. That's not. I don't think that's.
But I point to your example of the person who's working in ministry, as I think, like, you should worry a little bit what people are going to think. And I think there is sort of, like, at times, like, that is appropriate. But the best places I've seen this done are actually people working in campus ministry. I've talked to some people that are like, I don't know what to do. I have some students that like to do this thing, and they like freak out because they think they assume these college students have showed up with this ideological plan and they're trying to tear down the modern Catholic Church. And reality, like, the places that do it best are just like, great, I have these students to do this, I have these students to do that, these students over here, and like, you know what, we're all just gonna have pizza after Mass and everybody gets along, which was my experience in college, which is why I loved it. But I always try to remind people that if there isn't like this ideological, like, impetus for wanting to do more traditionally minded things, there is something going on with young people, and maybe it's a matter of like delineating, like, what is a sacred space, how do I like show my identity as a Catholic. I'm curious how the young people you were talking to were thinking about those issues.
I would characterize it as like a hunger for the sacred, and a sense that when you discover what is sacred, you revere it and acknowledge it as sacred. And so I think the secular culture is very much the opposite in the way that there isn't much of the sacred, and everything has been kind of, like, as you said earlier, flattened, and there's a kind of, you know, anything goes mentality, and it's hard to have space for that in the secular culture. Even if you want to take something like art, and an agreement about art, an agreement about beauty, and what these things look like. And I think when young Catholics are drawn to the more traditional aesthetic, insofar as it is just the aesthetic, I think it's a sense of this is something holy, and this is something that should take us out of ourselves and transport us, and we should act like it's real, and we should have that sense of sobriety in believing that it's real. I think that's what they're drawn to, and I think the reason they're hungry for it is because the secular culture is so lacking in it.
We had a recent exchange in American Magazine about reverence and the liturgy, and one of the points that the author Rachel Liu made about, like, how do you know what is reverent? Because reverence is, worshiping God. How do we know how God wants to be worshipped? But one of the points she made was that, people can be subjective in what they think is beautiful and reverent, but it's easier to feel that something is connected to something outside our own time and space if it has been handed down from generations, and not just something that came to you from the secular culture or from the generation just before you. So I think that might be behind a little of like the reaching back, because, I don't know, Vatican II was a practice in reaching back into the church's history, and maybe you think that reaching back to 1950 isn't actually an authentic recovery of Catholic tradition, but maybe in a time when things change much more quickly, there is some that's the stability and tradition that they can reach for and recognize.
Yeah, and there are things throughout the church's tradition that have been lost that are worth recovering. I think there's a sense of that as well. Whether it's something as simple as, there's some really great Catholic Renaissance music, right? Just something as simple as that. It was written by people who
St. Louis Jesuits, what you're talking about.
But it's there, it's transcendent. It was written to honor God, to glorify God. It could mean the same thing in our time as well, to your point about reaching back. And, whether it's just customs, saying the rosary as a family, or things that people maybe remember from their childhood, there is a lot of good stuff that maybe has faded away that is worth bringing back. It's not all the bad stuff that that we like to focus on.
I have a family member who complains about a priest that she knows. I think I've left that vague enough. Because he's so slow with how he does the Mass. And the way I put it to her, I was like, well, he thinks slow is equivalent with reverent, which is not always the case. And, this family member is one of the holiest people I know. So I don't think she has no ideological axe to grind. She is just annoyed by the slowness of this priest when he's, quote, doing the dishes at the end of Mass. And so, we are always arguing about what is reverent. I'm interested in the theological or spiritual reasons for why young people are drawn to it. But I tend to think it's much more just psychological and cultural. We want to make meaning for ourselves. We want to have some kind of sense of our identity. And I think something like the U.S. bishops are talking about whether to bring back meatless Fridays, so not eating meat every Friday, which is something we as Catholics used to do, but stopped because, whereas now they're actually, this could be a good way to fuse this older practice with new Pope's environmental goals. And that for me is the sweet spot when we have this recovery of a tradition that sort of reaches across these different ideological lanes and kind of comes at this new consensus that. For me, if we can start looking for more things like that, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, and I think with the example of giving up meat on Fridays as well, there was a kind of practical element as well, which is it trains you self-denial, which is important as a Catholic. And it's very easy to complain. You're oh man, I gotta not eat anything 1 hour before Mass. Oh, it's such a pain. And you think, what was it they did before? It was
all day, sun up to sundown. But then again, that was when you were a farmer, you had to go to Mass and then go home before the sun came up. So
Right.
it wasn't that much of a sacrifice. That's all I'm saying. It's like they
Well, I don't know.
could eat by like 8 a.m.
I don't know if everybody was a farmer, though. I mean, there must be some non-farmers.
I tend to think, I tend to like put that rule in the same category as like daylight savings time, where it's
Yeah.
like I think people, anyway.
But
Not everyone's
it
a
was,
farmer.
It
You're
was
probably
more.
right.
It was more hardcore. I think, speaking of my, just for myself, I feel like I complain very easily about things. I'm like, is this really that much of a sacrifice? Probably not. Like, So yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons for recovering some of these things.
You don't have that little voice in your head that just says, yeah, it is. Or that's just me. It is. You did a good job today, Zach. You deserve the gummy bears.
Well, yeah, I do. And then later I'm like, that was not the right voice to listen to.
I have a question. In your reporting, did you confront yourself with this question of like, do I want to start veiling? And you mentioned that you don't, but I'm curious if you're comfortable sharing why or why not.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It just doesn't, just as a purely personal thing, it doesn't seem to me like something like I feel drawn to doing. And it's hard to articulate why, because I really don't think there's anything wrong with it. And if somebody said to me, oh, I would love to do this, but I don't want to because I don't want people to judge me, or blah, I'd be like, I don't think that's a good reason not to do something you feel drawn to do. I think I probably would feel pretty self-conscious in a way that for me personally would be distracting, and I could fight to overcome it, but like, why would it when I'm perfectly happy, like not covering my head in mass? I wish I had some deep sophisticated answer, but it's just basically like, I don't really want to.
Yeah, and I think that goes to what Zach said. Like, a lot of this is just like, gut stuff that we tend to pre or post rationalize. But like, oh, this is why I do it, and that's why I voted for this person. Like, a lot of it is pre-rational.
It's exactly. I mean, I will say, like, I don't consistently dress up for Sunday Mass, but I kind of prefer it when I do. I feel like if I've just like rolled out of bed and I'm wearing jeans and like a sweatshirt and a mask, which I do sometimes.
It hashtag still counts.
It 100%. It 100% still counts. But for me, again, just as a personal thing, not saying what other people should or have to do. I do sometimes say like, okay, like I'm being a little sloppy. Like I could make the effort for Jesus. I could do it. So yeah, that's my thing. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe God wants me to do it. But I'm not feeling that. I'm not feeling that in big glaring red lights. So.
Yeah. Well, you said we're all a little judgy, but you seem less judgmental than most, which I really appreciate.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your reporting with us. We do have one final question for you before you go that we ask all of our guests, and that is if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, veiled or not, who would it be and why?
Oh, wow. I so wish I'd done my homework and knew this was the question. If I could canonize anyone, okay, I'm just going to take the really easy out here and I'm going to say my mom.
Moms are big popular answers here. What's your mom's name and why?
Mary. She's the most selfless person I know. She never thinks of herself. I'm one of 5 kids. She's always thinking of us, and she's not exactly perfect, but I feel like all the suffering us kids put her through, by the end, she will be. So,
all right, I just wanted to double check something. Yeah, so there's already a couple St. Marys, so we need one more of St. Mary of...
Oh, St. Mary of Glasgow.
Of Glasgow,
there you
perfect.
Go.
All right, awesome. Maddy Kearns, thanks so much. You can read her in the Free Press, which we'll link to your stuff in our show notes. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.